It was late October in a small town in Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Halloween was the highlight of the year. The leaves had turned deep shades of red and orange, carpeting the streets, and there was a biting chill in the air that made people pull their jackets tighter around themselves. The scent of wood smoke from fireplaces drifted through the neighborhood, mixing with the faint, sweet aroma of candy and caramel apples from front porches. Kids ran around in costumes, laughing and yelling, their voices echoing in the crisp evening air. But that year, there was something off. People didn't talk about it out loud, but everyone felt it. A heaviness in the air, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I was a senior in high school, just 16, and Halloween had always been my favorite time of year. Not for the candy or the costumes, but for the thrill, the scare, the way the dark, dark corners of the world seemed closer to the surface. My friends, Jake, Melissa, and Chris, shared that same obsession. That year, we decided to do something a little different. Instead of the usual neighborhood trick-or-treating, we wanted a real scare, the kind you read about in ghost stories or hear whispered about at sleepovers. It started when Chris mentioned an old, abandoned house on the outskirts of town. No one went there anymore. It was the McAllister place, a big Victorian house that had been empty for decades after a fire had killed most of the family. Rumors said the youngest daughter, Emily, had survived the fire but disappeared soon after, and nobody knew where she went. Some said her spirit haunted the house. Others claimed the house itself had become malevolent. Most of these stories were clearly exaggerations, but that only made them more enticing. We decided to go there that Halloween night. We packed flashlights, our phones, and some snacks, mostly for courage, and met at my driveway around 7:30. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a dark, bruised purple. The streetlights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the empty streets. The drive to the McAllister house was quiet, except for the occasional hum of tires on the asphalt. None of us said much. There was an unspoken tension. As we got closer, the house appeared like something out of a nightmare, tall, looming, with shattered windows that looked like jagged teeth, the wood warped and blackened from age and neglect. Ivy clawed up the sides, wrapping the structure in a tangle of dark green that looked almost like veins. A faint mist clung to the ground around it, curling through the dead grass and fallen leaves. We parked a little ways down the dirt road leading to the property. None of us wanted to be too close before we were ready. Chris volunteered to go first, holding the biggest flashlight, while Jake and Melissa stayed behind me. I remember the crunch of leaves under our shoes, how the air felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath along with us. The front door was hanging off its hinges, and when Chris pushed it, it let out a long, low groan. We all froze, and then Melissa muttered, "It's just an old door." But even as she said it, her voice wavered. The smell hit us next. Smoke, mold, and something else, something sweet but rotten, like decayed sugar. It made my stomach churn. We stepped inside. The interior was worse than we imagined. The floorboards were warped, and every step made them creak dangerously. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, the pattern faded and stained. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls, thrown by our flashlights. It was the kind of darkness that felt like it could reach out and touch you, heavy and oppressive. We started exploring room by room, moving slowly. The living room had the remains of burned furniture, the edges blackened and charred. There was a fireplace, cold now, with soot still clinging to the bricks. Pictures hung crookedly on the walls, blackened and peeling, the faces indistinct, ghostly. In one corner, a cracked mirror reflected our flashlights in jagged, disjointed angles. I caught my own reflection and felt my pulse spike. For a brief second, it didn't look like me. It looked thinner, paler, with sunken eyes that weren't my own. I shook my head and tried to laugh it off, but the image lingered in my mind. Chris suggested we check the basement. None of us wanted to, but it felt like the right thing to do, like the house was pulling us there. The stairs were narrow and creaked under our weight, each step sending splinters into the air. When we reached the bottom, the smell was worse, like something had rotted down here years ago and was never properly removed. The walls were lined with old, blackened wood, and in the far corner there was a faint glimmer, like someone had left a candle burning. Melissa started to whimper. "I think we should leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But Chris went toward the glimmer. I wanted to stop him, but my legs felt heavy, stuck as if the house itself was holding us there. As he got closer, the glimmer turned into a small figure. At first, we thought it was a mannequin, but as the light from our flashlights hit it, we realized it wasn't. It was a girl. She looked no older than 12 or 13, with black hair hanging in wet, matted strands. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her eyes were huge, dark, and hollow. She stared at us for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only seconds. Then she smiled, a slow, deliberate, unnatural smile, and stepped closer. We screamed. Melissa bolted up the stairs, Chris froze, and I grabbed Jake's arm. The girl didn't run. She glided toward us, silently. Her movements were wrong, like a puppet with broken strings. We turned and ran, stumbling up the stairs, tripping over broken floorboards, nearly falling down into the basement. Once outside, we didn't stop running until we reached the car. Our breaths came in ragged gasps, and for a moment none of us spoke. We drove away in silence, the house disappearing behind us in the mist. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The hollow eyes, the smile. Around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a photo sent to me from an unknown number. I opened it and my blood ran cold. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my own bed. Behind me, in the darkness of the photo, I could see her, smiling. I called Jake and Chris, but their phones went straight to voicemail. Melissa answered finally, her voice shaking. "She followed me home," she whispered. "I can hear her laughing outside my window." Over the next week, things got worse. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision. Doors slammed when no one was around. Objects disappeared and reappeared in places they shouldn't be. Every night, I would wake up to find small, wet footprints on my bedroom floor, leading to my closet. And sometimes, just sometimes, I would see her face staring at me through the window, smiling that same unnatural smile. We tried to tell our parents, our teachers, anyone who would listen, but no one believed us. They said we were imagining it, letting the Halloween stories get to our heads. But it wasn't imagination. It was real, and it was following us. One night I stayed up, determined to confront whatever it was. I sat in my darkened bedroom, flashlight in hand, waiting. Hours passed, the house silent except for the occasional creak. Then I heard it, a faint, dragging sound coming from the hallway. I held my breath. Slowly she appeared, her face pale, hair hanging in wet strands, eyes hollow, smile stretching wider than it should. I screamed, and she disappeared. I ran out of the house, not stopping until I reached Jake's. When I got there, I found him sitting in the living room and staring at the wall. Behind him, scratched into the wallpaper, were words written in a shaky hand. "We see you." That was when I realized we weren't just being haunted. We had disturbed something in that house, something that had decided to follow us home. And it wasn't just Emily's ghost. It was her anger, her loneliness, her thirst for attention. And now, we were trapped. The following days were a blur. We didn't go to school, didn't answer calls, and barely ate. Every night, she would come, sometimes one of us, sometimes all of us, watching from the shadows, whispering in voices that weren't ours, leaving messages scratched into walls, written on mirrors, carved into furniture. We tried to escape, to leave town, but every road we took seemed to circle back. The town itself felt wrong, as if it had shifted somehow to keep her close. By the third week, things escalated. Our dreams became nightmares, and the nightmares began to spill into reality. I would wake up to find my room rearranged, doors locked from the inside, shadows pressing against the windows. Melissa's hair started falling out in clumps. Chris began seeing people in mirrors who weren't there. And Jake disappeared one night. He had been in the house, his room asleep, and in the morning, he was gone. No note, no sign, nothing. We realized then that this wasn't just a haunting. This was a trap, a curse tied to that house, to Emily. Whoever went there, whoever saw her, was marked. And she was patient. She waited for us to get comfortable, to think we were safe, and then she came. Eventually, Melissa and I made a desperate plan. We gathered supplies, researched everything we could find about the McAllister house, and drove there in the dead of night. The house seemed even larger, more oppressive than before, the mist thicker, and the shadows deeper. We went in, chanting prayers, burning sage, doing everything the book said to ward off spirits. But as soon as we crossed the threshold, we knew it was hopeless. Emily was waiting. But she wasn't a girl anymore. She had grown, twisted by decades of anger, her body elongated, her eyes dark holes that seemed to swallow the light, her smile impossibly wide. She moved with a speed that was unreal, appearing in front of us, behind us, surrounding us. We screamed, tried to fight, tried to run, but the house itself seemed alive, walls closing in, floors shifting, doors disappearing. I woke up outside, the morning sun burning my eyes, alone. Melissa was gone, Jake was gone, Chris was gone. Only the house remained, silent, waiting, patient. And as I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw her standing at the edge of the tree line, watching, smiling. I left town the next day and never returned. I moved across the country to another state, thinking distance would help. But even here, on the other side of America, I sometimes see her. In reflections, in shadows, in the corner of my vision. And every Halloween, without fail, I hear the scratching at my window, the soft giggle of a girl who never left. Years later, I read that the McAllister house burned down completely. No one lives there now, and most people in town say it's finally gone, but I know better. She's not bound by wood or brick or fire. She follows, waits, and she never forgets. Every Halloween, I remember that night, the cold air, the smell of rot and smoke, the way she smiled, and I know deep down that one day she'll catch me again. Story the end. It was the kind of Halloween night that sticks in your memory, not because it was particularly cold or stormy, but because it carried the weight of something unseen, something that made the air itself feel heavier. I had just moved into a small town in Pennsylvania called Miller's Grove, a place I picked for its cheap rent and proximity to my new job at a local hardware store. I was 26, newly single, and had recently left a life in Philadelphia that felt more suffocating than exciting. I didn't know anyone in town, but that didn't bother me. I was used to being alone. Still, there was a subtle unease in Miller's Grove that I couldn't ignore, a faint hum of quiet streets at night, the kind that made you notice shadows lingering longer than they should. I lived in a small duplex on the edge of town, close enough to the woods that I could hear rustling late at night, but far enough that the traffic noise from the main street didn't reach me. The previous tenants had left in a hurry, leaving behind some furniture and a few old Halloween decorations stuffed in the closet. I didn't care much for decorating, but I thought it would be fun to put out a few of the old decorations. Among them was a carved pumpkin with a crooked smile and some fake cobwebs that looked more real than I expected. I placed the pumpkin on the front steps and stepped back to admire it. It was around 6 in the evening, and the sun was just dipping below the treetops, casting everything in an amber hue. That first night, I stayed in, drinking a beer and watching a horror movie I had downloaded. The wind whispered through the trees outside, making the branches scratch against the siding of the house. I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but every time I turned my head, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to paranoia and finished the movie. At around midnight, I went to bed, leaving the window cracked slightly to let in some fresh air. That's when I heard it. The first knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps on the front door. I froze. It didn't make sense. Who would be at my door at this hour in a town where I didn't know anyone? I got up slowly and peered through the peephole. Nothing. No one. I walked back to bed, but the knocking started again, this time from the back door. My heart was racing. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation. The dispatcher sounded calm and told me someone would check the area, but by the time I looked out, the night was silent again. I couldn't sleep after that. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me flinch. The next day, I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but there was a strange feeling in the neighborhood. Kids were trick-or-treating and most houses were decorated, but a few were dark, almost deliberately so. I walked up to a neighbor, a middle-aged woman named Carol, who had lived there for decades. She was handing out candy to a pair of kids in skeleton costumes. I introduced myself and asked about the house next to mine, which had been abandoned for months. Her face went pale. "You moved next to that place?" she asked. "Honey, that house, it's never been empty. People leave, but something always stays. Strange things happen there on Halloween every year. Don't go near it." I nodded politely, but curiosity gnawed at me. That night, I couldn't resist peeking out the window toward the abandoned house. The windows were dark, but I thought I saw a figure standing in the second floor window, watching me. I blinked, and it was gone. The following week, things got stranger. I began finding objects in my house that I didn't own. A small, childlike doll appeared on my kitchen counter, even though I had no children. The TV would turn on by itself, always showing static, and sometimes I could swear I heard whispering coming from the hallway, just out of earshot. I considered calling someone, but I didn't want the embarrassment of being labeled crazy. Then there were the dreams. Every night I dreamt of walking through the woods behind my house, following a path that seemed familiar but impossible. At the end of the path was the abandoned house, and every time I tried to leave, the trees shifted, guiding me back. The figure in the window would always be there, and it wasn't human. Its face was dark and blotchy, eyes too large, teeth too many, a smile stretched inhumanly wide. Halloween arrived, and the air was crisp with that eerie, anticipatory energy that only comes once a year. I had gone out to pick up a few last-minute decorations and a bag of candy, trying to act normal, but the unease in Miller's Grove was palpable. That evening, I dressed casually, planning to hand out candy and maybe have a beer. Around 7, I started hearing laughter from the street. Kids in costumes were running from house to house, but something about their behavior felt off. They moved too quietly, too quickly, and sometimes they would pause and stare directly at my house, their eyes hollow, faces painted or masked, but with expressions that seemed almost alive, almost knowing. I shook my head, thinking I was just tired, and went back inside. At 9 o'clock, the knocking returned. This time, it was heavier, more insistent, and it came from both doors at once. My phone had no signal. My hands were shaking, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. I approached the front door, trying to convince myself it was a prank. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. Then, a scraping sound, like fingernails dragged across wood, reverberated through the door. My stomach dropped. The back door creaked open slowly. I froze, too terrified to move. That's when I saw it, a shadow, elongated and malformed, moving through the kitchen toward me. It wasn't walking, not in the way a person walks. It glided, as if the floor itself refused to hold it. I ran to the bedroom and slammed the door, grabbing the baseball bat I kept under the bed. The shadow lingered in the living room, watching, its presence oppressive and suffocating. Then the whispering started, low and guttural, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My instincts screamed to leave, but the front and back doors were locked from the inside, and the windows had somehow become opaque with condensation that wasn't from the cold. I felt trapped, and my mind raced for an explanation, but nothing made sense. No one had been in the house, and yet everything around me was alive with intent. I remember thinking about the abandoned house next door. Maybe the stories Carol told weren't just superstition. I ran to the window, trying to see if the figure had moved there. But the lights were on in the empty house now, though no one lived there. Shadows flickered across the windows, and I could swear they were moving in patterns, almost like they were mimicking human gestures, waving, beckoning. My rational mind collapsed under the weight of fear. Something wasn't just watching. It was interacting, knowing my presence. Hours passed. I don't remember exactly how, only that dawn began to filter weakly through the trees. When I finally dared to open the bedroom door, the house was silent, the shadows gone. The doll from the kitchen had moved to the center of the living room, its small painted face turned to me as if it had been waiting. The front door, locked as I remembered, now hung open, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. Outside, the children in the street were gone. No one spoke of the previous night. No one acknowledged it. But the sensation remained, the brush of eyes that lingered longer than they should, the knowledge that I was being watched in ways that defied logic. I didn't sleep that day. I packed what I could into my car and drove to the only motel within 30 minutes. I didn't care about leaving behind my furniture, my clothes, or anything else. The thought of staying another night in that duplex was unbearable. That night, from the motel room, I watched Miller's Grove in the distance. Halloween was over, and yet I could see shadows flickering across windows, trees swaying though there was no wind, and a figure standing in the upper window of the abandoned house, smiling at me, watching. I wanted to tell someone, call the police, but I knew they would never see what I saw. How could they? It wasn't human, not in any sense that could be reported or understood. And I knew, deep down, that the house next door wouldn't be empty next year. Something would return. Something would always be there, waiting for the next Halloween, waiting for someone to notice, waiting to be invited in. I never went back to Miller's Grove. I found a place in another town, far from woods, far from old houses, far from anything that resembled a Halloween tradition. But every October, I feel it. The creeping sense of being watched, the urge to check my windows and doors, the unease that comes from knowing that some things are not bound by reason or reality. People laugh and call it imagination, Halloween hysteria, or superstition. I don't argue anymore. I just remember the eyes in the window, the shadows that moved on their own, and the whispers that promised they were never leaving. Years have passed, and yet every Halloween I dream of that house. I walk the path through the woods, always drawn back to that abandoned house, always seeing the figure in the window. It is patient, unyielding, waiting. And I know one day I will see it again in the waking world. Some things once noticed, never let go. Story, the end. It was one of those crisp October evenings in rural Pennsylvania when the air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant smoke from wood-burning fireplaces. The kind of night where the wind seemed to whisper through the trees, carrying secrets that no one dared speak aloud. I had moved to a small town called Millstone only a few months prior, after taking a job at the local historical society. The town was picturesque. Old brick buildings, gas lamps flickering along Main Street, and the occasional horse-drawn carriage for tourists. It had the charm I had imagined, and yet, even on its sunniest days, there was a feeling, a subtle tension, like the town itself had memories it preferred to keep buried. Halloween in Millstone was a big deal. Every year, the residents would go all out. Elaborate decorations, pumpkin carving contests, and the kind of haunted house setups that seemed more authentic than anything I'd seen in bigger cities. This particular year, the local high school had organized a Millstone Haunt event, where the older students created a haunted trail through the woods on the edge of town. Being new, I wasn't familiar with all the old stories, but I had heard whispers. People claimed there were places in those woods you just didn't go after dark. Kids would dare each other, grown-ups would shake their heads, and then everyone would move on as if acknowledging it might summon trouble. I chalked it up to small-town superstition and didn't think much of it. At first. On the afternoon of Halloween, I helped set up a small booth at the festival square. There were homemade caramel apples, hay bales, and an old hay wagon turned into a spooky ride for the kids. Everything seemed cheerful, almost picture-perfect. But as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I felt a subtle unease. Maybe it was the way the shadows stretched unnaturally long across the cobblestones, or maybe it was the stories I had overheard about the woods. Either way, when a few local teens came running up, urging me to join them on the haunted trail, I hesitated. I wasn't much for scares, but the idea of joining the town's traditional Halloween night sounded like the perfect way to integrate myself into the community. We walked along the trail in a group of 5, 3 teenagers, including my coworker Lisa, and one older man named Mr. Harrow, who insisted on guiding us. The path snaked through dense trees, thick underbrush scratching at our jackets, and faint sounds of rustling leaves that weren't entirely from the wind. The trail was supposed to be staged with props and actors, but as we moved deeper, it became unsettlingly quiet. The laughter and screams from the festival square faded until we were completely alone in a darkness that felt almost solid. "I've been coming here every year for 30 years, Mr. Harrow said, his voice low, "and I've seen things you're not supposed to see. Don't stray from the path." The warning was enough to send a shiver down my spine. The others laughed nervously, teasing him, but I could tell Lisa wasn't entirely comfortable either. We followed the narrow trail until we came to a clearing. Here, someone had set up fake tombstones and cobwebs, but it looked eerily real in the dim glow of our flashlights. Then I noticed something strange, footprints in the dirt that weren't ours. They were large, uneven, and seemed almost to sink into the ground. "Must be one of the actors," I said, trying to sound casual, though my heart rate spiked. Mr. Harrow frowned. Actors don't leave prints like that. We moved on, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling until we reached a part of the trail bordered by old, decaying trees. The wind had picked up, carrying a faint whispering, like hundreds of voices murmuring all at once. We all froze. Lisa clutched my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Yeah, I admitted. "It's probably just the wind." But the whispers grew louder, almost forming words. I couldn't understand them, but the tone was pleading, panicked. One of the teenagers, Mark, tried to joke about it, saying, "Maybe the trees are haunted." He laughed, but his voice trembled. As we continued, I noticed something else, shadowy shapes moving between the trees. At first, I thought they were other people, perhaps late-night hikers or teenagers trying to scare us. But the shapes didn't move like people. They darted too quickly, too fluidly, disappearing whenever we tried to focus on them. "I think we should turn back," I said, my voice firmer now. Mr. Harrow shook his head. "No, we're close. Just a little farther. You'll see why the town calls this place special." The closer we got, the colder it became. The air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. And then we saw it, a small, crumbling cabin hidden behind the trees. It looked abandoned, but the door was slightly ajar, and inside we could see flickering light. "I don't like this," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "Come on, it's just a cabin," I said, though I couldn't shake the feeling of dread pooling in my stomach. We stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under our weight. The flickering light came from candles arranged in a circle in the center of the room, and in the middle was a small carved pumpkin with a face that seemed far too realistic, almost alive. Surrounding it were objects that made my skin crawl. Old photographs with the eyes scratched out, faded newspaper clippings about missing children, and what looked like ritualistic symbols etched into the walls. "Okay, that's enough," Mark said, backing toward the door. "We shouldn't be here." Before anyone could respond, the door slammed shut behind us. The candles flared, casting grotesque shadows across the room. The whispers returned, louder, more urgent, and this time I could make out words. "Leave, or stay forever." Panic set in. We tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Lisa was crying quietly, and Mr. Harrow was staring at the pumpkin, his face pale. Suddenly, the carved face shifted. It was smiling at us, in a way that no pumpkin should ever smile. The shadows around us began to move independently of the candlelight, twisting and stretching across the walls like living things. Something hit Mark from behind. He screamed, a sound that will haunt me forever, and then the room went cold. My breath became visible even though it wasn't that cold outside. I could see my own fear reflected in the shadows, and they began to take on shapes. Shapes of people, children, animals, things that shouldn't exist. I don't remember how we got out. One moment we were trapped, the next we were running through the woods, the sounds of whispers chasing us until we reached the main trail. The cabin, the pumpkin, the shadows, they were gone. It was as if nothing had existed except for the terror etched into my mind. The next morning, we tried to return with local authorities, hoping to show them the cabin, the symbols, anything. But when we reached the area, the trees were dense and unbroken, as if no trail had ever existed. Mr. Harrow refused to speak about it afterward, and the teenagers didn't want to discuss the event either. Weeks later, I learned from an old town historian that the area where we had wandered was infamous. Over 100 years ago, a family had lived there and was rumored to practice dark rituals. Children had gone missing in those woods, never to be found. Locals claimed that on Halloween night, the spirits of the lost children would return, sometimes leading unsuspecting people into the forest, where they could vanish forever. I didn't return to Millstone the following Halloween. I left the town at the end of my contract, unable to shake the memory of the cabin, the whispers, and the faces in the shadows, but I still think about it. Every year when Halloween comes around, I see those pumpkin-carved smiles in my dreams, and sometimes late at night I hear faint whispers outside my window. It's been 10 years since that night, and I've learned to live with the memory, though it never truly leaves you. People tell me it was just a combination of fear, imagination, and old tales, but I know what I saw. The shadows, the whispers, the feeling of being watched, it was real. And I know deep down that one day Halloween will come again and the forest of Millstone will call me back. Story the end. It was late October in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of town where Halloween wasn't just a holiday, It was an obsession. Streets were lined with carved pumpkins, fake cobwebs draped over every porch, and the smell of candied apples and cider hung thick in the air. For most kids, Halloween was a thrill, a night of costumes, candy, and harmless scares. But for me, that year, it would become the kind of memory that never leaves you, the kind you try to block out, but somehow the shadows always bring back. I was 16, and like most of my friends, I'd been planning for weeks. We had the route all mapped out, which houses gave out the best candy, which ones were the spooky ones with haunted decorations and actors jumping out. My best friend Carter and I had decided to take it a step further that year. Our idea was simple: go deeper into the woods behind our neighborhood to the old Henderson property. Everyone in town had stories about it. How Old Man Henderson had died there decades ago, how people claimed to see lights in the windows even though the house had been abandoned for years, and how the locals swore they heard crying from the woods at night. Of course, the older kids said it was bullshit, just stories parents told to keep kids away from the woods. But the thrill of exploring a haunted location was too tempting for us to resist. We met up around 7:30 p.m., backpacks full of flashlights, candy, and phones in case we needed to call for help. The streets were crowded with families, and kids ran from house to house screaming with joy in their costumes. Carter was dressed as a vampire, complete with fake fangs and red contacts, while I was wearing a skeleton suit with glow-in-the-dark bones. We laughed as we walked toward the edge of the woods, the cheerful chaos of the neighborhood fading behind us. The woods themselves were dense, and the path leading to the Henderson property was overgrown, barely recognizable. We had our flashlights, but even the beams barely pierced the darkness. As we got closer, the air grew colder. Not just the kind of cold that comes from a crisp October night, but something heavier, like the air itself was thicker. It's hard to describe, but I remember thinking that every time I took a breath, it felt like the forest was pressing in on me. When we reached the clearing where the house stood, it was worse than I imagined. The Henderson house was a two-story Victorian, its paint peeling and windows boarded up, but from the shadows it still looked alive somehow. One of the boards covering a window was loose, and through the crack we thought we saw movement. Carter, ever the bravado-driven one, whispered, "See? I told you this place was haunted." I wanted to laugh, but my stomach was twisting. The woods were silent behind us, too silent. No crickets, no rustle of leaves, nothing except the occasional gust of wind through the broken trees. We approached the house slowly, our footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. Carter pushed the loose board aside and pointed his flashlight inside. It was pitch black, but for a brief second, I thought I saw a figure standing at the far end of the room. A man. Or maybe a shadow. My mind tried to rationalize it, maybe a trick of the light, but my gut told me otherwise. We didn't go in at first, we just stood there, frozen, listening. Then we heard it, the faint sound of sobbing. It wasn't the kind of crying a person makes when they're sad and alone. It was desperate, raw, and it came from inside the house. Carter froze. I felt my heart pounding so hard I thought it would break through my chest. The wind picked up, rattling the boards over the windows, and the crying stopped. Maybe we shouldn't, I whispered, my voice shaking. Carter looked at me with that grin he always wore when he was about to do something stupid. "Come on, it's just a story," he said. "We're not going to get hurt by a ghost." I followed him in anyway, partly because I didn't want to be the coward, partly because I was too curious to turn back. The inside was worse than the outside. Dust covered everything. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like drapes. Broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. The smell was unbearable, like wet wood, mildew, and something rotten underneath it all. We moved carefully, flashlight beams scanning the corners, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. We reached the staircase to the second floor. That's when it started. The crying came again, louder, closer, coming from the hallway at the top. Carter tried to say something, but his voice faltered. I felt a cold draft brush past me, like someone or something had just walked right through me. We climbed the stairs slowly, hearts in our throats. At the top, the hallway stretched before us, lined with closed doors. The crying was coming from the last door on the right. Carter reached for the knob, but before he could turn it, the door swung open by itself. I swear it moved with intention, as if someone inside was inviting, or dragging us in. We shone our flashlights into the room. It was empty, but the crying had stopped. Instead, there was a faint scratching sound coming from the corner. We pointed our lights that way, and I almost screamed. There in the corner was a small figure, a girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, her dress torn and dirty, hair matted. She was rocking back and forth, her face hidden in her hands. We called out to her, but she didn't respond. Then she looked up, and I'll never forget her eyes. Completely black, no whites, just black, staring at us. And then she started to speak, not words, but a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. "Get out," it said, dragging the syllables like nails on a chalkboard. Carter grabbed my arm. "Run," he whispered, and we bolted down the stairs. I tripped over a broken chair, scraped my hands and knees, but we didn't stop. The crying and that low voice followed us, echoing down the hallway, bouncing off the walls like it was right behind us. We reached the front door and tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge, like something was holding it shut. That's when we heard footsteps, running footsteps upstairs. Not ours. Heavy, dragging, impossible to ignore. Carter pounded on the door, screaming, and I joined him. The footsteps stopped, then the sobbing returned, louder than ever. The front windows rattled, and then, as suddenly as it started, everything went quiet. The door swung open on its own. We didn't hesitate. We ran into the woods, not looking back. Leaves tore at our clothes, branches scratched our faces, but we didn't care. The streetlights of the neighborhood finally came into view, and we slowed down, panting, crying, unable to speak. When we got home, we locked the doors, tried to convince ourselves it was just our imaginations. But the next day, when I went to school, I noticed Carter wasn't there. He had called his parents saying he wasn't feeling well, but I knew better. When I tried to reach him, his phone went straight to voicemail. That night, I heard knocking at my bedroom window. Small, deliberate taps, like a child's fingers. I looked, but no one was there. Over the next few weeks, Carter disappeared completely. His parents said he had been staying with relatives, but nobody really knew. And I wasn't the same. Every Halloween, every time I passed the Henderson house, I felt that same cold press of air, that same weight in my chest. I even saw the little girl once more, standing at the edge of the woods, staring at me with those black eyes, whispering, "Get out." Years later, I moved away. But every October, no matter where I was, I felt it. Like something had followed me, tied itself to that night. I've tried to tell people, but most think it's just a story, a memory warped by fear. But I know what I saw, and I know the Henderson house wasn't empty that night, and I know Carter never truly left. That Halloween wasn't just a night of candy and costumes for me. It was the night I realized that some stories in this town aren't stories at all, and some things never let you go. Story the end. It was a crisp October evening in 2007 in a small town just outside of Salem, Massachusetts. Autumn had settled over the streets with a mix of golden leaves and creeping shadows, and Halloween was just around the corner. Families were preparing for trick-or-treaters, hayrides were being advertised at local farms, and everyone seemed to carry an air of excitement. But for a group of 5 high school friends, this Halloween would become a story they would never forget, a story that would haunt them for years to come. The group consisted of Alex, Sarah, Mike, Jenna, and Tyler. They had been inseparable since middle school, and like many teenagers, they were always looking for something thrilling, something that would make them feel alive. That year, their plan was to spend Halloween night doing something different. They decided to explore the abandoned Holloway house on the outskirts of town. Holloway House had been vacant since the late 80s after the family living there mysteriously vanished, leaving everything behind. Local legend had it that anyone who dared spend the night there would be cursed, that strange noises and figures had been seen inside, and some kids swore they had even seen faces in the windows, peering out at them before disappearing. It was 7:30 p.m. when the group piled into Alex's old Dodge. The air was thick with the smell of wet leaves and distant smoke from backyard bonfires. Mike, the joker of the group, tried to lighten the mood by telling exaggerated stories about Holloway House. "Did you guys know they found a diary once?" Mike said, smirking. "Apparently, the daughter of the family wrote about, I don't know, shadows following her around at night. Creepy stuff. She vanished a week later." Sarah rolled her eyes but didn't deny it. "Yeah, Yeah, we've heard the stories. Let's just go see the place before it gets too dark. I don't want to be stuck out here after midnight. Tyler, always the skeptic, laughed. Haunted houses, ghosts. Come on, it's just a decaying old mansion, probably full of raccoons or something. But even he looked uneasy when they pulled up to the property. Holloway House was worse than any of them expected. The mansion sat atop a small hill, its blackened windows staring down at them like empty eyes. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, the paint peeling off the siding, and a twisted metal gate creaked in the wind. A large tree leaned perilously toward the house, its bare branches scraping against the roof. There was a smell in the air, a mix of damp earth, rotting wood, and something metallic that made Alex wrinkle his nose. Looks even creepier than the pictures online, Jenna whispered. She had been researching the house for weeks, fascinated by the stories and old news articles. Alex parked a few yards from the gate. All right, everyone, stay together. No wandering off. Let's just go in, take a look around, and get out before it gets too late. They climbed over the rusted gate, and the crunch of dead leaves beneath their feet sounded unnaturally loud in the still night. As they approached the front door, they noticed it was slightly ajar, as if someone or something had left it open. Maybe we shouldn't go in, Sarah murmured, gripping Alex's arm. Tyler scoffed. Or maybe it's just a draft. Come on. Alex pushed the door open slowly. It groaned loudly, echoing through the hollow interior. The air inside was thick with dust, and the smell of mold was overpowering. Their flashlights illuminated torn wallpaper, broken furniture, and shattered glass. The house looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry decades ago, with personal belongings scattered around. A cracked porcelain doll, a tarnished mirror, an old rocking chair that seemed to sway slightly though there was no wind. This is insane, Jenna said. It's like stepping into a different time. They began exploring cautiously, moving from room to room. Each floorboard groaned under their weight, sending shivers down their spines. Occasionally they would hear faint creaks or the sound of something tapping against the walls, but every time they looked, there was nothing there. About an hour into their exploration, they reached the second floor. A long hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors, some hanging off their hinges. At the far end, they noticed a faint light flickering from under a door. That's weird, Mike said. There shouldn't be any lights on in here. They exchanged uneasy glances, and Alex stepped forward. Maybe it's a reflection or some leftover candle. Let's just check it out quickly. He opened the door to find a small bedroom. Inside, the light came from a single candle on a nightstand. But what caught their attention was the writing on the walls. In what looked like smeared ink or blood, the words "Get out" were scrawled repeatedly. Holy, what the hell? Sarah gasped, backing away. Jenna took a step closer, examining the writing. This isn't recent. Look at how faded it is. Someone wrote this years ago. Tyler frowned. Still, who would leave a candle burning in an abandoned house? Suddenly, a loud crash came from downstairs. The group froze. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy, echoed up the staircase. Maybe it's just an animal, Tyler said, though his voice wavered. Alex held up a hand. No, that sounded human. They debated leaving, but curiosity overpowered fear. They decided to investigate, creeping back down the stairs. As they reached the bottom floor, the temperature seemed to drop drastically. Their breath became visible in the cold air, and an oppressive heaviness settled over them, like the house was closing in. In the living room, they saw it. A figure standing by the fireplace, unmoving, facing away from them. It was tall, thin, and dressed in what looked like old-fashioned clothing. The flickering candlelight illuminated the outline of its head. It seemed almost too perfectly still. Mike swallowed hard. Guys, that thing, is it alive? The figure slowly turned. Its face was pale, gaunt, and expressionless, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into them. A low, guttural sound escaped its throat, and before they could react, it darted toward them with unnatural speed. Screams filled the house. Alex grabbed Sarah and bolted toward the front door, but the other three were separated in the chaos. The figure seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared, leaving only a cold, echoing silence and the smell of decayed wood. Alex and Sarah stumbled outside, gasping for air. Their flashlights scanned the yard, but there was no sign of the others. Panic set in. Mike? Jenna? Tyler? Alex shouted, his voice breaking. No response. They ran toward the road, hoping someone would see them. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, they reached the edge of the property. A car passed by, and the driver stopped when they waved frantically. "Are you okay?" the driver asked, concern in his eyes. We need help. Our friends." Alex struggled to speak. The driver called the police, who arrived quickly. Officers searched the Holloway house thoroughly but found no sign of the missing teens. There were no footprints in the yard, no evidence anyone had been inside besides Alex and Sarah, and certainly no signs of a supernatural presence. The candle, the writings, the figure, gone. It was as if the house had swallowed them whole. Alex and Sarah were questioned repeatedly, but their story was dismissed as hysteria or a prank. No one could explain the disappearance. Days turned into weeks, and despite searches, news coverage, and community efforts, Mike, Jenna, and Tyler were never found. Over the years, Alex and Sarah tried to move on, but both were plagued by nightmares of Holloway House. They would dream of the tall, thin figure, the candlelit room, and the words, "Get out." Sometimes, when walking past abandoned buildings, they swore they saw shadows moving just out of the corner of their eyes. Every Halloween, they felt compelled to drive past Holloway House, though neither spoke of what they truly felt inside: fear, guilt, and the haunting memory of that night. They eventually learned that the Holloway family had vanished in 1989 under mysterious circumstances. There were rumors of occult, dark rituals, and unexplained phenomena surrounding the property, but nothing was ever proven. The house sat empty, decaying further with each passing year, a silent witness to its dark history. In 2015, Alex received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the three missing friends standing in what looked like the very bedroom where the words "Get out" had been written. Their expressions were blank, almost lifeless, and in the corner of the room, barely visible, was the same tall, thin figure, standing as if waiting. Alex's hands shook as he showed it to Sarah. They never spoke of it again, and both kept the photograph hidden from anyone else. The town moved on. Halloween came and went every year, but for Alex and Sarah, the night of 2007 was never over. Holloway House still stood at the edge of town, abandoned and decaying, but alive in a way that no one could explain. And every October, when the wind howled through the trees and the shadows grew long, they remembered. They remembered the screams, the figure, and the friends they had lost, friends who may have never truly left. Years later, the house was eventually demolished, replaced with a generic subdivision of townhouses. But locals reported strange occurrences, flickering lights, strange noises, and the occasional figure glimpsed in the windows. Some claimed the spirits of Holloway House lingered, waiting for the next group of thrill seekers to enter. Alex and Sarah never returned to the area, but they kept in touch, sharing nightmares and unexplainable experiences. And every Halloween, when the wind rustled the trees and the shadows danced in the streetlights, they would remember that night. The night the house took their friends, and the night they learned that some doors should never be opened. Even now, decades later, they sometimes wonder if Mike, Jenna, and Tyler are still out there somewhere, trapped between the world of the living and the dead, watching, waiting. They wonder if Holloway House ever truly releases anyone who enters. And deep down, they know the answer is no. Story the end. It was a crisp October evening in a small town in Ohio, the kind of town where everybody knew each other's names, and Halloween was treated almost like a sacred tradition. The streets were lined with carved pumpkins, their flickering candles casting a soft orange glow across the lawns, and the scent of fallen leaves mixed with the faint smell of bonfires lingered in the air. Kids in costumes darted from house to house, their laughter echoing down the quiet suburban streets. For most, Halloween was harmless fun, but for a group of friends that year, it became a night they would never forget. Emma, a college student home for the weekend, had been looking forward to it for weeks. She, along with her brother Jake and their friends, Mia, Kevin, and Tyler, had decided to go on a haunted house crawl, visiting all the local spots rumored to be spooky. It was a tradition they had started a few years back, each Halloween trying to outdo the last with more daring and scarier locations. They were young, adventurous, and confident. Nothing could truly scare them. Their first stop was an abandoned house at the end of Maple Street. The house had been vacant for years. windows boarded up, the paint peeling, and the yard overgrown with weeds. Locals whispered about strange occurrences, lights turning on and off, shadows moving behind the broken windows, but nobody went near it at night. Emma and her friends, armed with flashlights and the bravado of youth, decided it was the perfect start to their night. As they approached, a chill ran down Emma's spine. The air felt heavier, almost electric, and the leaves crunched under their feet in a way that sounded louder than usual. Jake waved off her unease with a laugh, saying, "It's just the wind. We've got this." They climbed over the broken fence and made their way to the front door. The wood groaned as Kevin pushed it open, revealing a dark, empty foyer. Dust motes floated in the thin beams of flashlight, and the smell of mildew was thick in the air. They moved from room to room, calling out to each other, joking and trying to be brave. But then something strange happened. Emma felt it first, a soft whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. She froze and whispered to Jake, "Did you hear that?" "Probably just the house settling," he replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Then Mia, who had been in the back, let out a small scream. The others rushed to her, shining their flashlights around. I swear I saw someone," she stammered, pointing toward a narrow hallway leading upstairs. There was nothing there, just old furniture, cobwebs, and shadows. They laughed it off nervously, convincing themselves it was their imaginations. After all, haunted houses had a way of playing tricks on the mind. But as they turned to leave, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Emma's heart pounded as she tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. Kevin slammed his shoulder against it repeatedly, finally managing to wedge it open just enough to slip through. They spilled out into the night, hearts racing, adrenaline high. Jake tried to make light of it, saying, "All right, maybe that one's a little too haunted for us," and they quickly moved on. The night continued, and the group visited several other haunted spots, an old cemetery, a rundown barn, and a deserted school building. Each place had its own eerie atmosphere, but none of them compared to the feeling that had lingered at the first house. As midnight approached, they decided to end the night at a local attraction, the haunted corn maze on the outskirts of town. It was known for being immersive, with actors in elaborate costumes jumping out from the corn stalks to scare visitors. The maze was dimly lit with torches and lanterns, and the air smelled of damp soil and hay. At first, they laughed, shouting at the actors who tried to scare them. But as they went deeper, the sounds of laughter and music from the entrance faded, replaced by the rustle of the wind through the tall corn. The path became narrower, twisting in ways that made it hard to keep track of each other. Emma felt an unsettling sensation, like they were being watched by something more than just people in costumes. Then Tyler noticed something odd. A figure stood still in the middle of the path ahead, tall, thin, dressed in a dark, tattered cloak. Its face was obscured, but it seemed to be staring directly at them. He waved to get its attention, thinking it was part of the maze, but it didn't move. They approached cautiously, and as they got closer, the figure suddenly darted into the cornfield, disappearing entirely. A chill ran down their spines, and they tried to convince themselves it was just an actor taking a shortcut, but none of the staff admitted to being in that part of the maze. They pressed on, trying to finish the maze, but the path seemed endless. Every turn led them deeper, and soon the exit was nowhere in sight. Emma began to feel panic rising. "This doesn't feel right," she said, her voice trembling. "We should have been out by now." Kevin, trying to remain calm, suggested, "Maybe we just got turned around. Let's backtrack." But as they retraced their steps, the path seemed unfamiliar, twisting in ways they hadn't taken before. Shadows moved at the edge of their vision, and the sound of whispering wind became almost like voices calling their names. Fear was settling in like a heavy fog. Hours seemed to pass. They tried to call for help, but their cell phones showed no signal. Emma's stomach twisted with dread. "Something is wrong," she whispered, barely able to breathe. They stopped at a small clearing and huddled together, trying to figure out what to do. Then they saw it. Footprints in the soft earth, too large and too deliberate to belong to any of them. The prints led off the path into the deeper, darker part of the cornfield. "Should we follow them?" Mia asked, voice shaking. Jake shook his head. "No, we need to stay together and find the exit." But as they argued, the whispering voices grew louder, more insistent, surrounding them. The shadows seemed to move independently, bending and twisting like living things. Panic turned into terror. Suddenly, Tyler screamed. Something grabbed his arm from the shadows. They pulled him, but there was no one visible. He was yanked into the darkness, and his scream was cut off abruptly. Emma and the others rushed toward him, but all they found was the imprint of a hand in the dirt where he had been. They ran, screaming, following the path, hoping it would eventually lead them out. Hours later, exhausted and traumatized, they stumbled out of the maze as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. Staff members were nowhere to be seen, and the maze itself seemed strangely untouched, as if they had never been inside. Tyler was gone. No one had seen him since the pull into the darkness. The police were called, but no trace of him was ever found. The investigation revealed nothing. No tracks leading away, no surveillance footage, nothing. The town was shaken, but life went on. Emma, Jake, Mia, and Kevin were left with the haunting memory. Every Halloween afterward, Emma felt the chill of that night, and every time she drove past the corn maze, she would swear she could see a dark figure watching her from between the stalks. She couldn't explain it, and nobody believed her. But she knew what they had experienced was real. Years later, Emma returned to the area as an adult. She walked past the old haunted house on Maple Street, now boarded even tighter than before. She could still feel the presence there, the same suffocating weight of the air. And though she tried to convince herself it was just a memory, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness from that night had never truly let go. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear whispers just outside her window, faint and distant, calling her name, reminding her of what had been lost. Halloween would never be the same. For those who had faced the darkness that night, the world had shifted. Fear was no longer just a story told to children. It was real. And it lingered, just beyond the light of a flickering candle, waiting for the next time someone dared to walk too close. Emma never returned to the maze again, and none of the friends ever spoke of it publicly. But each year, as the leaves turned and the air grew cold, she could feel it. Something watching, something waiting. Tyler's disappearance remained unsolved, and the townspeople whispered about the maze, saying it had always been cursed. But Emma knew better. She had seen it, felt it, and survived it, only barely. And she understood, with a clarity that terrified her, that the darkness didn't want to be understood. It wanted to be feared. Years passed. Emma grew older, but she could never escape the memory. Each Halloween, she felt compelled to revisit her hometown, to see the places she had once walked, to make sense of what had happened. But no matter how rational she tried to be, every shadow seemed to move, every whisper seemed to echo her own name, and every flicker of light reminded her that the line between the living and the unseen was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. And somewhere, in the silence between the laughter of trick-or-treaters and the rustle of fallen leaves, she could feel him, the boy they had lost, the boy who had been taken into the darkness. And she knew he was not alone. The maze, the abandoned house, the shadows, they were all still there, waiting for the next soul to wander too far, to linger too long, to notice the whispers just a little too clearly. Emma tried to warn others, but nobody wanted to hear it. Stories like hers were dismissed as exaggerations, youthful pranks, or the power of imagination. Yet she knew the truth. Every year as Halloween approached, she felt the chill creeping up her spine, the unmistakable weight of unseen eyes, and the soft call of voices that didn't belong to the living. Some part of her wondered if she had ever truly left the maze, or if it had left a piece of itself inside her, marking her forever. She could not escape it, and she did not want to, because she understood something horrifying. The darkness feeds on those who do not remember, those who do not fear, those who think it is only a story. And Emma remembered every detail, every scream, every whisper, every shadow that moved just beyond the light. Even now, decades later, when the town was quiet and the streets empty, she would walk past the abandoned house and feel the air grow heavy. She could hear it calling, whispering, reminding her of what was lost and what was always waiting. And she knew, deep down, that Halloween would never be just a night of fun and costumes. It was a night that belonged to the shadows, to the unseen, to those things that could never be explained and that could never be stopped. And one day, if she wasn't careful, it would come for her again. Story the end.